Thank you for having me today. This is, without a doubt, the most intimidating room in digital publishing for a number of reasons, most of which is that just about everyone here is deep in it. You are making tools yourself, you're making content yourself, you're running things, you're building things. This is not one of those settings where you can throw some gunpowder in the fire and all the natives. So things that we talk about here actually have to have some substance, which is great. But fortunately, is my favorite kind of people for precisely that reason. Both because of the quality of thought, the combination of practical application and experimentation, my favorite place to do this kind of thing in the whole year. So I'm crunched into the back half of the day with a fairly unglamorous session title. There it is right there. And the reason for this is very simple. This is what I can only describe as defensive conference programming. Between Kat, Mike Shatskin, Peter Brantley, all of these people have learned, working with me for a while, that I don't actually commit to what the thing's going to be about until essentially the last possible minute, because you want the good stuff. You want the new things that we're just learning. We know without doubt that trying to book one of these things 3 months in advance is to basically wait a lifetime. So what you want is the new hotness. You want the new stuff that we've just learned in the last couple of days. Otherwise, you end up booking a session like this, where we talk about trends in tablet page-turning behavior, revisionist view, and then I show up, and you get something like this, which is an entirely different kind of session. Wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't you want? I want to know that. Next year, I'm coming back. So as a concession, of course, because Peter is a gracious and stylish man, he gave me some unnecessary punctuation, just to make it look a little cooler. So I'm happy about that. So when we were trying to figure out what this should be about, we sent a bit of an appeal out to Twitter to kind of ask people what they wanted to hear. We also sent some questions out to some mailing lists and got some responses back in terms of if you had a captive ebook retailer in front of you, who had access to a large data set and a compulsion towards sort of oversharing, what would you ask them? And we got some good stuff back, and they kind of came into two separate buckets, probably because of the nature of the program that Peter put together here. There was sort of a whole group of questions around authoring and self-publishing, and specifically, how do we see that sort of evolving and changing around the world as Kobo moves from place to place, and to a certain degree, how is it behaving differently in different languages? There were a few questions around price and how price was changing for self-publishing, and just kind of generally, where is that part of the market going next? Okay, so kind of took that in mind. The other big category of stuff was around the reading experience, and most specifically, not about purchasing, but what happens after a book gets bought. What happens when you kind of get to the other side of that transaction, and what do we know about that? So I'm going to dig into two of those, an author versus reader data battle royale, and we'll see what we come up with. So a little bit about Kobo, very, very shortly. Of about 11 million users, we produce a range of lovely e-reading devices that get sold around the world. We have a catalog of about 3 million titles, some of them are housed on the servers right behind you here. We run ebook stores all around the world in a number of different languages, in many different countries. And we power ebook experiences for a number of retailers around the world, which kind of gives us a sense of the differences in shape and fabric of ebook markets from country to country. And now also lets us start to look at the differences between large chain retail, the kind of people that go there, and we start to power independent bookstores this year as well, with the ABA here in the US, the BA in the UK, and starting to walk around the world to other associations as well, as everybody wants to be a part of this. And in terms of our engagement with authors, we have a service called Kobo Writing Life, a set of tools that people can use in order to publish their book through Kobo and distribute it to all of the various countries and storefronts that we have around the world. And so we spend a lot of time talking to authors and engaged with authors. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what they're doing and what they want to do. And also what is going on in their books, what's happening with the books that they sell, and where do they sell, and what can we learn about sort of what's going on inside them too. And so, we're delivering ebooks all around the world, delivered ebooks into about 190 countries last year. And so the world looks like this. The self-publishing world looks like this. It is a very English language sort of place right now. And the heart of it is the self-publishing dream factory of the United States of America. The U.S., they say everyone has a novel in them, but we actually have the data. We know that everyone in the United States has 5.7 novels in them. Most of them are series. Half of them are shockingly erotic. The other half have to do, at least, with the romantic entanglements of vampires and werewolves. But so the U.S. very much was the genesis of kind of what I would call the self-publishing revolution. But it's kind of quickly spread throughout English language markets. So the U.K. being the next biggest for us, Canada and Australia after that. But what's been most fascinating about that is the degree to which those books have sold all around the world. So from that base of English language titles, we've delivered them to roughly 144 different countries. So people purchasing that self-published content in places like Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan and Guam, where amazingly they like vampire romance just as much as anyone else. And in some ways, the U.S. now has this odd new role. In that it has become the center for low-cost manufacturing of stories. The U.S. is outproducing in sort of self-published content in a way that is completely over-indexes every other country that we're in. But as we started to make these tools available, and by the way, this is in no way a bad thing. This is what we see as kind of both a change in the economics, a change in the relationship between publishers and authors, and certainly a change between authors and retailers. We love that. But we also started to see other languages showed up. We'd see people kind of roll up their sleeves, and even though they weren't native English speakers, would plunge into our tool set and would start to upload their books. And so we were getting submissions from about 85 countries right now on the self-published side. And most of those were coming in English, but they were coming in still from a lot of different countries. And what we could see was people would write in their native language, dive into an English tool set, kind of scramble around, and eventually get their books up. But looking at the languages they were writing and looking at the places they were coming from, let us start to look at where else should we do this. So we lit up another 5 languages just a couple of weeks ago at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and what was interesting about that was, with 6 languages worth of interface now, including English, it radically expanded the number of languages that we started to see submissions in. Because then, instead of just having English being the one language that you could kind of navigate your way through, if you knew any of those 6 languages, you could now get your book up and start to sell it all around the world. And that really changed kind of the fabric of it. So we saw some really significant growth in things like German. And then seeing those books sold in a lot of different countries outside of Germany, wherever there were German language speakers who wanted access to whatever the German equivalent of the vampire romance of Germany. Actually, it's very rarely vampire romance in Germany. It's a whole set of other stuff. But what it turned into was a shocking amount of growth for us on the German self-published sales side. The same thing happened in France, where we got to see kind of which languages were really international and which ones were only kind of a little bit international. So these were all of the languages that we sold, or all of the different countries we sold French language content into around the world. And that turned into another 275% of sales growth on those particular titles. So we also saw, as we kind of moved from country to country, that pricing was evolving and was evolving in a different way than what we saw on sort of the trade side of the business. So, the average price of a self-published book, kind of varied a little bit country to country with a couple of standouts. It was the difference of kind of a few cents to maybe $1 from one country to another. French, shockingly low, surprisingly. Dutch, surprisingly high. Spanish, lowest of all the major markets that we were in. And this looks completely different from what we see when we look at what I would call ebooks coming from kind of the traditional publishers. And these look much more like a parallel to what you see in the print side of the business. They may come down a bit from the average print price in that country, but French books are generally considerably more expensive than English books, as are German and Dutch. Spanish a little bit lower, and that doesn't really look anything like what we see on the self-published side. And so, from everything that we can see, self-publishing is becoming a much more uniform set of sort of pricing decisions informed by global sales patterns as opposed to kind of traditional ebook pricing, which tends to be very much drawn from kind of the pricing culture of the local country. And so that's something that we kind of find fascinating, that self-publishing pricing and self-publishing practice is much more sort of transnational. And people are learning as they go. When we first started in self-publishing, we were getting ebooks from a lot of aggregators. We were companies that bring together a lot of self-published authors and then push those books onto retailers like us. As we exposed our own set of tools and as we started to have a more direct relationship with those authors, pricing changed very radically. Authors started to optimize for the price tolerances of our particular customers, acknowledging that those may be different than what we see on other retailers. So you end up seeing price distributions like this. People could see that on Kobo, you could generally sell a self-published book with a certain amount of momentum and a certain amount of kind of self-promotion on the part of the author, kind of around $4-ish and change. Very different than what we saw on the aggregator side, where everything was shoved down into the 99-cent range, in the hopes of generating bestseller coverage. Now, and some of that also has to do with the way that we calculate bestsellers, which is different than some other retailers. So, our way of tracking sales velocity and our way of sort of deciding what a bestseller is a little bit different. And authors, given the choice and given the control, will solve for that. So, in this, we really are in the largest experiment in price optimization in the history of publishing. We have all of these people who are focused on managing their 5.7 books and being incredibly attuned to the movement of markets in that. And we find that fascinating. And what we want to know is what else can we do? So we give them lots of tools, we give them lots of data, we show them how their books are selling around the world and what the composition of that looks like. But we know there's more that can be done. And so this is where we kind of bridge from authors to data. What are the other things that we can do with the authors that we've got? And this thesis that we're kind of operating on is that authors and publishers are kind of like submarines. You're in a submarine, you're down there, underwater, and unit sales, the unit sales coming back are kind of like sonar. It's the only thing you have to tell you where you are in space. They're the only things that tell you whether you're close or far away for something. You can't see anything. It's the only stream of data that you have coming in. And that means that we see a lot of behavior that's about optimizing for price. See people doing tons of experiments to figure out what's the right price of a book and how should I price it differently. And certainly in the context of agency, we had publishers spending a lot of time and effort doing that. We do a lot of that on the retail side as well. But it means that all of this analysis is kind of working within one dimension. Price related to format, price related to time, price related to length of time the book's been in the market. What else could we do? There's got to be more to it. What if we didn't just look at what people bought? What if we looked at what they actually read and finished? So we know that the one fundamental flaw of sales data is that it only tells you that people bought it. It doesn't tell you, whether they looked at it and they didn't buy. It doesn't tell you whether they liked it. And ebooks, and especially ebooks within kind of ecosystems like Kobo and others, make some new metrics possible. And So, we can look at, as a retailer, what did they look at but not buy? A very traditional conversion number that you would see as an e-commerce person. What's the ratio of page users versus purchases? And we can also look at whether they started books that they purchased, and whether they finished them. So, we know that people don't always read what they buy. We also know that they don't always like what they read. And we know that you're more likely to finish something that you like, and you're more likely to abandon something that you don't. And so what we start to be able to look at is kind of what's that full life cycle of a book purchase from looking to finishing. And what can this tell you that just looking at unit sales doesn't? So, looking at conversion and optimizing for conversion is a very retail-centric point of view, but were this data available to a publisher, you could start to look at the efficacy of your metadata. You could start to look at covers and descriptive text and pricing and preview, and whether or not those were working to get someone to the point that they were putting a book in a basket or they were adding one to an e-reader. And you can look at placement then. As having a book on the front page do more to my purchasing? What about being on a bestseller list? What about email marketing that's being done on my behalf or that I'm doing myself? And that's all good. But statistics about finishing books we find really interesting because it gets us just a little bit closer to what did the reader like in a somewhat sort of data-driven way. Because we know that unit sales is a lot about how good you are at marketing and the brand of an author. Unit sales and the print context is about where is the book in the store? Do you have it in a, in a table up front? Did you buy co-op? Did you buy an end cap? For digital, it's about, did I crack that threshold on the bestseller list that lets my book sort of claw its way up above the, kind of the undifferentiated miasma to the point where it gets a little bit of sunlight on it. And that tends to drive unit sales. But it creates handicaps. First-time authors get handicapped. Mid-list titles get handicapped. Titles with low sell-in on the print side and titles with low bestseller rank get hit on the digital side. And so what we're really looking for is a new way to value a book. Did they like it enough to finish it is one of the things that we're starting to look at. And we do this always within the context of an incredibly rigorous view towards privacy. We're looking at big aggregates and we're looking at large sets of data, but we're interested in how this is valuable. So we're starting to do a little bit of early analysis here. And so what if I told you that we had 100 unsigned self-published authors who had large and growing audiences whose books were more likely to be finished than James Patterson? That would be an interesting thing. That would be kind of a neat thing to know. You have authors that have not been signed, authors that do not have a relationship with any publisher or agent, who have books that people will start and absolutely finish. When we look at the performance of sort of books getting closed and books getting finished, we see that the big six publishers, kind of on average look more or less the same. They're publishing books in every possible genre and every possible subject, a wide variety of authors and types. They kind of even each other out. But we see specialty publishers that significantly outperform the majors, as in their books are 15% more likely to get finished than from a mainstream publisher, usually because they're focusing in particular genres and particular kinds of books that people are compelled to finish. But we can also see variations inside a publisher, which are very interesting. So, we can see, for example, that there are 2 fiction imprints inside Random House right now. One of them has books that get finished 45% of the time. The other has books that get finished 65% of the time. And that to me is absolutely fascinating. What is going on inside that imprint? What is going on in that editorial process that's leading to those 2 very different kinds of behavior? We know that there's this constant problem of putting a whole bunch of books out into the market and then trying to figure out which ones get backed with marketing. What if you could see that there was a mid-list book that everyone who picked up did not put it down until they finished it, read it through the night. That the time that it took from the time that they opened to the time that it finished was unlike anything you were seeing in any other cohort of similar books. You would do something interesting as a publisher if you knew that. If we knew that there were particular authors whose books were compulsively read and quickly read, you would do something differently there. And we know as a retailer, essentially the most profitable thing we can do is connect a reader with an author that they will read for the rest of their life. So the identification of those authors, who people are really excited about, becomes really interesting. And possibly gives us a way to look for that kind of word-of-mouth momentum without having to look at large numbers of unit sales. Using metrics like this, and maybe we don't care that it sold 100,000 copies. If it sold 10,000 copies and absolutely everybody finished it, that's an interesting book. So we're starting to work with this data a bit now. We're starting to use it internally. We're using it to help drive some personalization and some recommendation. We're starting to use it for some CRM. It works really well for some kinds of books. So we can know fiction on average, a book that gets purchased in fiction gets finished about 45.5% of the time. Juvenile fiction about 38% of the time, but with really wide shoulders on the data set. There's some books that get finished almost every time, some books that get started and almost never finished. Genre fiction, science fiction, almost 50%, fantasy and paranormal, almost 50%, romance, just over 50%, the highest of all of kind of the mainstream categories in terms of the likelihood that a book that gets started gets finished, romance. It works okay in certain kinds of narrative and popular nonfiction. A biography that gets started about 38% of the time, 39% of the time will get finished. A history book only about 27, 28%. It doesn't work in non-narrative nonfiction. Obviously, it doesn't work for reference. It doesn't work for STM or textbooks. It doesn't work for poetry. Anything that you pick up and put down, anything you use as a reference or an aid or a guide, anything like a cookbook, it doesn't work. And it doesn't solve the problem of which books are critically good, but no one reads. It can't help us with that. We're still working on it. This is something I think quite in its infancy right now. There's a lot of noise in the data today. Turns out it's actually hard to tell when a book gets finished in ebooks and e-reading. There are endnotes at the end of a book. There are endorsements. Publishers jam all kinds of stuff back there. The about the author is back there, and more books by the author is back there, and 8 or 10 sets of sort of ancillary matter sits back there. So it takes us a fair bit of work on the analytics side to figure out when a book is actually done. And that's something that's constantly refining. The data set will get cleaner and cleaner as we do that. There are also what I can only describe as behavioral factors that are involved here. We were looking at this data literally just a couple of days ago, and we found an odd set of books with bizarrely high completion rates. And it's like, really? And they were, and you're looking at this and you're like, okay, I've got Tom Clancy, Weird Dolphin. I mean, they're different, but there shouldn't be that much of a difference. 100% complete. Why would this possibly be? It turns out, whatever book you're reading, gets displayed on the front of your e-reader. So, if you pull an e-reader out of your bag and it has Pride and Prejudice on it, that's cool. You pull your e-reader out of your bag and it has, Weird Dolphin Love on it, that may make you uncomfortable as a reader. So people would, whether they were finishing the books or not, go all the way to the end, finish it, mark it as closed so that it came off the screen and got hidden in behind. Who knew? These are the things we're learning. So, we're starting to look at what's the best way to share this. What's it worth in our relationship between ourselves as a retailer and a publisher? How would it guide and inform kind of behavior on the part of self-published authors? Because in all of this, what we're trying to do is help publishers make better decisions. Publishers making better decisions help us, and result in more and better books in the hands of the customers we're serving. So this is something that we're going to kind of keep churning away on over the next while, and we'll let you know how it goes. Thank you very much. I have 4 minutes for questions. All the Weird Dolphin questions you want. Yes?
Not about dolphins.
Okay.
The question is there a correlation between if the book is
Where we started to look at that but haven't finished looking at it is in series, in sort of series behavior is the first place that we've looked at it. And I mean, most of the answers that we've had are quite common sense so far, but we haven't seen any big surprises there. The least completed book in the series is the first one. And it essentially sort of, there's then a curve that sort of grows over time, but it doesn't grow right to the end of the series. It tends to kind of peak in the middle and then start to taper off towards the end, so far. Again, it's another place that's a little bit noisy, but fortunately series stuff gets consumed at a very high rate, so the data set is better than we have for some other authors. Linking together purchases from one author to the next is kind of the next big piece of work that we're doing right now. What we're currently identifying is authors who in aggregate just have much higher completion rates as a whole. And then eventually you start to look at the behavioral side of, if somebody starts this book, finishes it all the way, what's the likelihood that they'll make it to the next one? That's kind of the next piece of work that we're doing right now. Yeah, in the front. So the question, if you couldn't hear, what's sort of the impact on sort of the intersection between social and completion, it's interesting because what we see is, and it really shouldn't be any surprise, people have a public life and a private life. They have the books that they like people to know that they read. Those get shared a lot. Not necessarily proportionate to the amount that they get finished. And they have the books that they actually read, which they will much more likely to complete, but they may not tell anyone about. We see when we feed social recommendation into social data into recommendation algorithms, it does, the conversion goes up. A book that your friend likes and has talked about, and if you like other books that they've also liked and talked about, you're more likely to like that book as well. Yes. But in terms of kind of correlation to purchase, a book that you've finished, and if I like books that you have, other books that you've finished, I'm more likely to like that next book that you finished as well. So finishing generally more powerful than sharing in terms of a recommendation driver. Yeah. Yes. I know. No, it's looking at kind of the heat mapping of essentially kind of completion and drop-off becomes interesting. It's a little early to say whether that provides kind of really good decision support guidance on the part of an author, but we think it would be good to know if 50% of your people left in chapter 3. Like, that would be a good thing to know. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.